I'm really excited about working with the Indigenous Science Cluster to try to develop Indigenous-led research questions that use isotopic data. Because we're part of this discipline that studies the past, and in particular here, the past in this place and in North America, I think we really have a responsibility to the people whose past we're studying. And so if we can develop research questions with them that they are interested in and that they can use the data for things that help their communities and help them, then that makes this research so much more valuable than if we're just doing it because we think it's interesting. The LOA Isotope Lab is a facility in the Department of Anthropology. It houses 3 isotope ratio mass spectrometers, which are instruments that we can use to find out about the chemical compositions of organic materials, and we use those chemical compositions or isotope values to find out about ancient people, animals, and the environment that they lived in. One of the great things about this kind of research is that there's a huge range of questions that you can address using the data that we can produce in this lab. But most of the questions fall within 3 main categories. Questions about diet, questions about mobility or migration or movement or sourcing materials, where they came from, and questions about the environment.
Sometimes human remains aren't available, and other times it's something we generally try to avoid doing analyses on out of respect for the descendants and the ancestors themselves. So we like to find a way of, a proxy or a way of getting around doing these analysis on human remains. And because dogs followed humans around in the past and ate their food and moved around to the same places as them, we can use them as an analogy, in a way, for their human keepers. So we often look at dogs as sort of a stand-in for humans. In many cases, they do have diets that are quite similar, and even when they don't, we can use them as an example of the kinds of foods that humans had on hand and were feeding to dogs, which tells us a lot about ancient economies.
In the mobility category, we can learn about where organic materials came from. So either where animals were moving on the landscape, were fish migrating, were bison moving over long distances, were deer moving to different areas, and also whether people may have been moving to areas to acquire these materials that end up in archaeological contexts. For example, in the Museum of Anthropology, we have some beautiful blankets produced by Salish weavers, and we don't necessarily know exactly where they got the goat hair or the dog hair that they used to make these weavings. But with isotopes and other techniques, we can get an idea of the areas in which these materials may have come from. So where people went to get the hair that they turned into these blankets. And in terms of the environment, we can ask questions such as, was it warmer or colder at a certain point in time? Was the ocean temperature warmer or colder? Was temperature on land warmer or colder? Was there more or less rainfall? And these kinds of things can give us a lot of insight into the choices that people were making in the past about what foods to gather and harvest, where to move, and how to live. What I love about stable isotope analysis is that it allows you to address such a diverse range of research questions using a single technique or a range of techniques that can be adapted in different ways. This type of work also allows you to address questions that are actually relevant in the present, even though we're studying the past. So we can produce data that's relevant to topics like climate change, conservation, and also hopefully to First Nations rights and title. There's a few reasons why I think this research and this facility is really important for the Indigenous Science Research Cluster. First of all, we have these tools that we hope will be useful to First Nations communities to answer questions that they want to answer, potentially questions that relate to Indigenous rights and title. Having this facility here in the Department of Anthropology also allows us potentially to train UBC students and also students or community members or any interested individuals from First Nations communities on the kinds of techniques that we use here. So allowing us to give training to community members and students in these methods if they so wish. Having this facility here also allows us to engage in really interesting collaborations with other facilities and researchers within the Indigenous Science Research Cluster. So by bringing the instruments in this lab together with the instruments in the PCI IGR facility and other facilities, we can amass multiple lines of evidence to answer similar questions, making our research much more powerful as a group than it would be just if any one lab were working on these questions alone.